Escape from the ritual house. The rainstorm had turned the streets into rivers, and I was relieved to finally reach the warmth of my home. The storm had knocked out the power, so I lit a few candles and settled in with a book. The sound of rain was usually comforting, but tonight it felt menacing. A knock on the door broke the silence. I opened it to find my neighbors, the Thompsons, standing there, soaked and anxious. "Can we come in? We need help," Mr. Thompson said urgently. "Sure," I replied, letting them in. The moment they were inside, they overpowered me. Mrs. Thompson gagged me while Mr. Thompson tied my hands. They dragged me into their house next door, which I realized too late was the source of my growing unease. I was taken to their basement, a place filled with bizarre symbols and lit by flickering candles. They placed me on a makeshift altar, their faces devoid of the kindness I once knew. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, fear choking my words. "You are our chosen one," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice cold. "The ritual must be completed tonight." As they began chanting, I struggled against the ropes binding me. My mind raced, searching for a way out. I noticed a shard of broken glass within reach and managed to grab it, cutting through the ropes. The Thompsons were so engrossed in their chanting that they didn't notice my escape. I freed myself and picked up a heavy candlestick, creeping up behind them. I struck Mr. Thompson first, then Mrs. Thompson, knocking them both unconscious. I ran upstairs, the basement door slamming behind me. I bolted out into the rain, my heart racing. I ran to a nearby house, banging on the door until a kind elderly couple let me in. "We need to call the police," I panted, drenched and trembling. The police arrived quickly, arresting the Thompsons and uncovering their disturbing ritual setup. They had been part of a secret cult, using their home for dark ceremonies. The authorities assured me that I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I moved away from the neighborhood, haunted by the memory of that night. The rain, once a source of comfort, now brought back the terror I experienced. I learned to be cautious and never take safety for granted, for you never know what darkness lurks behind familiar faces. The haunting of Willow Lane. The rain pounded against the windows, a relentless torrent that seemed determined to drown the world. I sat in my living room, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. The power had gone out hours ago, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I tried to lose myself in a book, but a persistent sense of unease gnawed at me. The rain had a strange, almost sinister quality to it tonight. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the house. I jumped, nearly dropping the book. Who could that be? I muttered, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight. I approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. 3 figures stood on my porch, their faces hidden by the darkness and the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated before calling out, "Who's there?" There was no response, just the sound of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. I backed away, my pulse quickening. The knocking resumed, more insistent this time. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The storm must have taken out the towers. I decided to ignore them, hoping they would go away. But then I heard a window shatter from the kitchen. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, my heart pounding in my chest. I crept towards the sound, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. When I reached the kitchen, I froze. The figures were inside, their faces illuminated by the flashlight. I recognized them instantly. They were my old neighbors, the Martins. They had died in a car accident 2 years ago. Seeing them here, drenched and ghostly pale, was a sight that filled me with dread. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. They didn't answer. Instead, they moved towards me, their eyes empty and lifeless. I backed away, nearly tripping over a chair. I needed to get out. I ran upstairs, locking myself in my bedroom. I could hear their footsteps following me, slow and deliberate. I pushed furniture against the door, my hands shaking. I needed to escape. I opened the window and looked down. It was a long drop, but the rain-soaked grass might cushion my fall. As I climbed out onto the ledge, the door burst open. The Martins reached out, their hands passing through the barriers like mist. I jumped, landing hard on the ground below. Pain shot through my leg, but I forced myself to run. I fled to the house at the end of the street, banging on the door until Mr. Thompson answered. He took one look at my drenched, terrified state and pulled me inside. "What happened?" he asked, his face pale with concern. "The Martins," I gasped. "They were in my house." Mr. Thompson frowned. "The Martins? But they're dead." "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But they were there." We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the house was empty. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of anyone but me. They suggested it was a hallucination brought on by the storm and the darkness. But I knew better. The Martins had come back, and their presence was all too real. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed my things and moved away, leaving the haunted memories behind. Yet every time it rains, I remember their ghostly faces and the terror of that night. I can't help but wonder why they came back and if they'll ever return.
The ritual of the rain. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the sky in brief, blinding flashes. I sat by the window, watching the rain pour down in torrents. There was something oddly mesmerizing about the storm, a feeling of being cut off from the world outside. My phone buzzed with a message from my neighbor. "Claire, can you come over? I need help with something urgent." It read. I grabbed my raincoat and headed out, the storm making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. When I reached Claire's house, I noticed something strange. The usually warm and inviting home was dark, the windows devoid of any light. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Just as I was about to leave, the door creaked open. "Claire," I called out, stepping inside. The house was eerily silent, save for the sound of rain pounding on the roof. Suddenly, I was grabbed from behind and dragged deeper into the house. I struggled, but the grip was too strong. I was pushed into a room where a group of my neighbors stood, their faces shadowed by candlelight. At the center was an altar covered in strange symbols. "What is this?" I demanded, fear rising in my throat. Claire stepped forward, her eyes cold and distant. "We need a sacrifice to appease the storm spirits," she said, her voice emotionless. "You were chosen." Panic surged through me as they tied me to the altar. The room filled with a low, haunting chant, the air thick with anticipation. I realized they had been planning this for a long time, waiting for the perfect stormy night. As the chanting grew louder, I noticed a sharp piece of metal on the floor within reach. I managed to grab it and began sawing through the ropes. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and I knew I didn't have much time. Just as Claire raised a knife above me, I broke free and lunged at her. The knife clattered to the floor, and I kicked it away, scrambling to my feet. I fought off my neighbors, using the piece of metal to defend myself. I dashed through the house, the rain soaking me as I burst outside. I ran to my house, locking the doors behind me. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands trembling. When the police arrived, they found the remnants of the ritual but no sign of my neighbors. They vanished into the night, leaving only the memory of their terrifying ritual behind. I couldn't stay in the neighborhood after that. I moved far away, but the fear remained. Every time it rained, I remembered that night and the neighbors who hunted their victims under the cover of a storm. The thought that they might still be out there, waiting for the next perfect storm, haunted me.